So I want to talk to you, we were talking about the eyes and the ears connected to something very much in the natural. Me being at a speaking engagement and watching more than I am listening. Well, that's not always the right thing to do because it literally tells us time and time again to be mindful of our eyes. And when we come into knowing the Lord and he removes the scales from our eyes, it's like we're looking with brand new lenses. So Samson had some problem with his eyeballs, and I'll tell you why, specifically when it came to lust. And out the gate, even when it was time for him to marry, he told his mother and father, even though they didn't want this to be the case because there was supposed to be no intermingling, he said, I've got eyes for her. I've got eyes for her. I want her. This is what I want. Go down and get her for me. I'm going to marry her. Well, there was the whole element of the lion capture. You need to get into Judges 13 to read. I'm not going to go through every tiny detail because that incident in and of itself is so dynamic because, well, I'm not going to tell you why because I could go into it, but the lion he slays, he actually comes back by after a long period of time because we know that a carcass has to decompose and the animals and all the things, and there was honey inside. And so that is a promise connected to the vision of the land of the milk and honey, right? The promises of God reign true. And so he went after this bride from a different city, a different tribe that he was not supposed to intermingle with. He did it anyway because of his eyes. His hearing was from his mom and dad, who he should have listened to. From the father, he should have listened to. He knew the commandments, he knew the rules, but his lust went after it anyway. What I find really interesting is as he was doing this, when the lion situation happened, the Spirit of the Lord came on him. And this is where it can get confusing because we think someone who missteps or chooses their own will outside of God's will cannot have covering. But our Father in heaven has intention beyond what we could possibly ask, think, or imagine, and his will be done. Let me say that again. His will be done. It's not a, I misstepped. No. Now, do not go out and just start living like Samson. We don't want that for you. We want righteousness to be a part of your life. Simultaneous to that, I can see so much of favor in my life in all the places I misstepped where God never left me. He never forsaked me. He'll never leave you. He'll never forsake you. And when the lions come to kill, steal, and destroy, you're going to have a might unlike any other, even when you have eyes for something else. Now, we've talked about desire a lot on the Pedal and Preach show on Fit and Faith podcast, and it's this understanding that it's of God, right? The desire is of God. When that becomes a little g God and you're putting your emphasis in flesh, which we know is the human spirit rather than the Spirit of God, we can get distorted, we can get distracted, but God wants us to love. He wants us to have intimacy. He wants us to marry and enjoy sex with our loved one. He wants that. However, we try to take it in our own will. Remember, his will be done. So even though his father said all of these things, there's something that was said that I think is really incredible. I told you that no matter what, God has his way, and there was purpose on his life outside what his city, his parents could even see. And I believe the same for Jesus's mom and dad, that they couldn't even possibly fathom what was to come, right? They were with it. It says his father and mother didn't realize that the Lord was at work in this, creating an opportunity to work against the Philistines who ruled over Israel at that time. Come on. So Samson told his father, get her for me. She looks good to me. And they didn't know that God was working even in that there was probably a desire in his heart. Do you remember when Moses approached Pharaoh and it said over and over again, God hardened Pharaoh's heart? I always thought that was so confusing, but this is kind of the same thing in the understanding that God is actually in control. Imagine that. He actually is in control even of our heart. Even of our heart. And so understanding that he had control over Pharaoh to harden his heart. Because I'm sure there were times where Pharaoh was like, I give up. I surrender. I see that your God is mighty. But it wasn't about Pharaoh. It was about the entire Egyptian territory, because that is how they were freed from slavery, the Israelites. It's all about God's people. He's trying to free you, even in the situation that you're in right now. And I think that this is a word for such a time as this, because our spiritual eyes have been weakened to cultural eyes instead of Christ's eyes. There are lenses. We get to choose every single day what lenses we put on. Are you putting on the lens of Christ or the lens of culture? Now, he was doing it with flesh, right? He saw something that he wanted. Who can raise their hand to something that they want right now that is a tangible asset? Something that you don't need, something you can't take to heaven, and you're like, I want that. Think of my kids. I want that, right? And it's not all wrong, and God can use it. But be mindful that what's to come from it. So anyway, he gets what he wants, right? He goes after the girl, he gets her, and sadly, later, there's a lot of debauchery about what happens. He ends up having to, well, he doesn't, but his wife gets killed because the dad ends up giving her to his best man later. So Samson gets really mad. He then is like so destroyed. There's all of this killing that transpires because of it. This is when he ties the foxtails together with the torches and they go through, and he was just trying to destroy the land, but he ended up destroying and killing a lot of people as well. Why am I telling you all this? And how is it connected to you? When it's connected to your spiritual eyes, you start to see later that we know Samson gets his eyes gouged out. I don't want to skip too far ahead without giving you context to his strength, because we hear that a lot, and this is the whole story of Samson, is his strength, right? So I think of Samson, I think of his long dreads, his locks, and I think of his muscles. I think of what he did with the lion. I think of what he did with killing all of these men. I think of what he did with the jawbone of the donkey when he was about to be attacked again by the Philistines. And after he killed so many of them, he kills thousands, right? He was strong. But when Delilah comes into his life after a prostitute, again, he had a little bit of a trouble with his line of sight and what he laid his energy into. Your eyes can destroy your physicality, okay? It can destroy your ability to hear from God. But he works all things together for good. And so I just ask that you surrender that to him and understand where your power and your might actually comes from. So when he gets into this relationship with Delilah, remember, God uses this. Eventually, his desire for Delilah trumps his desire for remaining in strength with God, remaining in alignment with the Lord.